Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. Today, on this YouTube channel, we will continue our look through Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster?, where we make sense of the Old Testament God. These are the contents of that book. Here is Paul Copan. Educated at Marquette University, employed by Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida. Written a lot on apologetics and philosophy and lives in Florida. Chapter 13, we're looking at the issue of slavery, part 2 in this book on the issue of slavery. So we've given a context and background regarding servitude in Israel, which was a noteworthy improvement on the slavery laws in other ancient Near Eastern texts. Yet there are still some challenging texts to consider related to slavery in the Old Testament. The first text that we will look at is related to beating slaves to death in Exodus chapter 21. It says, "And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property." Allegedly, this treatment of the servant, the word that is translated slave is better translated servant, for the use of the word slave is misleading. So allegedly, the treatment of the servant suggests to some that the servant is owned as a possession by another. This impression is reinforced by various translations that render the word loss as property. Now, the word that is translated that way actually literally means money. So, is this person a commodity to exchange rather than a person to value? That's the question. Now, the Old Testament affirms the full personhood of these debt servants in texts like those listed here. And this passage in Exodus chapter 21 also affirms the full personhood of these debt servants. If the master struck the servant so that the servant immediately died, the master would be tried for capital punishment. That is what he shall be punished means. The Hebrew verb nakam always involves the death penalty in the Old Testament. So I guess that Hebrew word naqam is what is translated punished in Exodus chapter 21, verse 20. The implication is that judicial vengeance is the result. This theme is reinforced by the mention of taking life for life in Exodus chapter 21, just a couple verses after our text that we're looking at, which follows on the heels of this servant beating passage. This confirms that the servant was to be treated as a human being with dignity, not as property. Now, that doesn't mean that a master would always obey the law that he was given, that he should treat the servant with dignity. The master could have chosen poorly to, instead of treating the servant with dignity, the master could have instead chosen to treat the servant as property, as something less than human. And that would be a poor reflection on the master, not on the God who made the law. It would be a poor reflection on the master who's breaking God's good law. So the staff or rod wasn't a lethal weapon. It was not like a spear or a sword. So what if the servant did not die immediately from the rod beating? What if he died after just a day or so? In this case, the master was given the benefit of the doubt that the servant was likely being disciplined and that there was no murderous intent. Of course, if the slave died immediately, there was no further need for proof. And if any permanent injury resulted, such as a loss of an eye or a loss of a tooth, then the servant was to be released debt-free. This is extraordinarily different treatment compared to other ancient Near Eastern laws in this regard. A repeated theme in this book, Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, is that these Old Testament laws, when compared to other ancient Near Eastern societies, the biblical laws were an actual improvement over the laws in these other ancient Near Eastern societies. For example, Hammurabi insisted that payment went to the master for such injuries to a slave. In the ancient Near East, where masters could treat slaves however they wanted, this passage upholds the dignity of debt servants. Why, then, does the passage say that the slave is the master's money or property? The suggestion here isn't that servants were chattel or property. The servant or employee came into the master or employer's house to get out of debt. So the employer would lose money by mistreating his employee. This harsh treatment would affect the income that the employer-master brought in. And if he killed his employee, the master would be killed as well. So murder was murder, whether the person was a servant or was free. It didn't matter. If murder took place, the master would be held accountable for murder. Let's go a bit deeper, though. Ancient Near Eastern scholar Harry Hoffner, a Hittitologist at the University of Chicago, rejects the common rendering, "he is his money," in favor of this one. That fee is his money or silver. This fee reading is based on the context of Exodus chapter 21, verses 18 and 19, part of a section on punishments dealing with quarrels and accidental killing. Quote, "If men have a quarrel and one strikes another with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but remains in bed, if he gets up and walks around outside on his staff, then he who struck him shall go unpunished. He shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he's completely healed," end quote. Like the modified Hittite law that required masters who had harmed their slaves to pay a physician to provide medical treatment, so here the employer had to pay the medical bills for the servant he had wounded. In verse 21, the Hebrew pronoun who refers not to the servant, he, but to the fee that paid to the doctor tending to the wounded servant. Harry Hoffner writes, "The fact that his master provided care at his own expense would be a significant factor when the judges respond to the charge of intentional homicide," end quote. Are these Exodus laws perfect, universal laws for all people in all societies at all times? As is repeated throughout this book, no. These are not perfect universal laws for all people in all settings, but in this and other societies, we continually come across improved legislation for Israelite society in contrast to surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures. As the Jewish scholar Nahum Sarna observes about this passage, quote, "This law, the protection of slaves from maltreatment by their masters, is found nowhere else in the entire existing corpus of ancient Near Eastern legislation," end quote. Now let's look at leaving wife and children behind in Exodus chapter 21, verses 2 through 6. It says, quote, "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free,' then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever," end quote. Nuzi was located near Kirkuk, Iraq, close to the Tigris River. Thousands of tablets, the Akkadian Nuzi texts from the 2nd millennium BC, were found in Nuzi. They mention legislation similar to this. If a slave encountered a master's home, single, he left single. If he entered with a spouse, then he left with his spouse. Now, if a wife had been given to him by his master, then she and any children from this union belonged to the master. According to this Exodus passage, if a man was given a wife by his master or employer and they had children, then he had a choice. The servant could either leave by himself when the 7th year of debt release came, or the servant could continue as a permanent servant to be with his wife and children. It's a less than ideal setting, to be sure, but let's probe the text more deeply. At first glance, this text seems to treat families and children unfairly. The apparently favored male can come into a service arrangement and then go out of it. Yet if the servant he married while serving his employer and any children who came while he served there, so it seems, stuck in the master's home and couldn't leave, that's not only any children, the wife and the children appeared to be stuck in the master's home and couldn't leave. That's not only male favoring, it strikes us as criminal. Wasn't this an earlier version of slave families during the antebellum South, like Frederick Douglass's, who were broken up and scattered by insensitive slave owners? Our first point in response to this is that we're not told specifically that this scenario could also apply to a woman, but we have good reason to think the situation was not gender specific. We'll see shortly that Deuteronomy 15 makes explicit that this scenario applied to a woman as well. This is another example of case law, where we see the principle that, quote, if such and such a scenario arises, then this is how you proceed in such and such a scenario, end quote. Case law typically was not gender specific. Furthermore, Israelite judges were quite capable of applying the law to male and female alike. An impoverished woman who wasn't given by her father as a prospective wife to a widowed or divorced man or his son could perform standard household tasks, and she could go free by this same law just as a male servant could. Various scholars suggest that the scripture text could be applied to females quite readily, such as if you buy a Hebrew servant, she's to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year she shall go free. If her master gives her a husband, and they have sons or daughters, the husband and children will belong to her master, and she will go out by herself. The law also makes perfect sense in the light of this shift. Its spirit isn't violated by doing so. Some critics, though, would rather fight than shift. Rather than applying these case law scenarios to both men and women, they'd rather put up resistance in order to make this law look its very worst. But we have no compelling reason to put up the resistance to make the law look its very worst. Again, Israel's judges would have looked to this general passage for guidance regarding female servants, simply because many verses in the law happen to use a masculine gender pronoun rather than altering between he and she hardly means that women are thereby being excluded. As an aside, the term Hebrew at this stage in Israel's history was broader than the term Israelite. The two terms would later be equated. The Hebrew people were not formally attached to established states like Israel, or like Egypt or Babylon. They were considered foreigners and non-citizens from the speaker's perspective. So this passage may well refer to a non-Israelite. That means the servant, possibly a foreigner, was to be released after 6 years, unless he preferred the security of his employer's household. In this case, he could make the arrangement permanent. For now, we'll assume that this passage refers to an Israelite servant, but we'll revisit the issue when we discuss Leviticus chapter 25. For our second point, let's for the moment stick with a male servant employee scenario. Let's say the male servant's employer arranges for a marriage between his male servant and a female employee. In this case of debt servitude, the employer's family would now engage in marriage negotiations. By taking the male servant into his home to work off a debt, the boss had made an investment. He would stand to suffer loss if someone walked out on the contract. Think in terms of military service. When someone signs up to serve for 3 or 4 years, he still owes the military even if he gets married during this time. Likewise, in Israel, for debts to be paid off, the male servant couldn't just leave with his wife once he was married. He was still under contract, and he needed to honor his contract. Even when his contract was completed, he wasn't allowed to simply walk away with his wife and kids. After all, they were still economic assets to his boss. What could the released man do? The released man had 3 options. First, the released man could wait for his wife and kids to finish their term of service while he worked elsewhere. The released man's wife and kids weren't stuck in the employer's home for the rest of their lives. The employer's wife and kids could be released when the wife worked off for debt. Yet, if the now free man worked elsewhere, this would mean he would be separated from his family, and his boss would no longer supply him with food, clothing, and shelter. On the other hand, if he lived with his family after release, he'd still have to pay room and board. So this scenario created its own set of financial challenges. For the second option that the released man had, he could get a decent job elsewhere and save his shekels to pay his boss to release his wife and kids from contractual obligations. What a great option! Why not take this route? Because it would have been very difficult for the man to support himself and earn enough money for his family's debt release. The third option for the released man was that he could commit himself working permanently for his employer, for a lifelong contract. He could stay with his family and remain in fairly stable economic circumstances. He would formalize this arrangement in a legal ceremony before the judges, which would be akin to as being before God, by having his ear pierced with an awl. Before coming up with all sorts of modern Western solutions to solve these ancient Near Eastern problems, we should make greater efforts to better grasp the nature of Israelite servitude and the social economic circumstances surrounding ancient Israel. We're talking about unfortunate circumstances during bleak economic times. Israel's laws provided safety nets for protection, not oppression, like the new atheists suggest. It's obvious that this arrangement was far different from the South's chattel slavery, in which a slave wasn't a temporarily indentured servant who voluntarily sold himself to live in another's household to pay off his debts. Now let's look at the engaged servant girl from Leviticus chapter 19. Chapter 19 of Leviticus, verses 20 and 21. Whoever lies carnally with a woman who's betrothed to a man as a concubine, and who has not at all been redeemed nor given her freedom, for this there shall be scourging. But they shall not be put to death, because she was not free. And he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, a ram as a trespass offering. This passage is different from Deuteronomy 22, which we had addressed earlier, and which deals with an engaged free woman. Here the situation involves a free man and a servant girl promised to another man. The man is clearly guilty of adultery. He seems to be a seducer who's taking advantage of his position over a servant girl, something like with King David and Bathsheba. We're dealing with the statutory rape between the seducer and the servant girl who was pressured to consent. In this murky and oft-debated passage, two issues are highlighted. First, the girl was engaged and not married. Second, she was a servant girl and not free. She hadn't yet been redeemed by a family member or liberated by her master. This is the reason given for not punishing the girl or the seducer. So her master wouldn't have had the typical claim on her, nor could he be compensated because she was engaged. This presents a kind of gray area in Israel's legislation with a mixture of a free person and an engaged servant. See the immediately preceding passages on mixtures in Leviticus 19:19. As with other laws regarding women, the goal of this law was to protect those who were more vulnerable. We know that it's easier for persons in vulnerable situations to be taken advantage of and even sexually harassed. In this case, the girl was taken advantage of, and she isn't punished. Notice, too, that though she has a diminished social status, this status is viewed as temporary. It doesn't prevent her from being given her freedom. Now, there's no death penalty for the man here, as we've seen that only murder requires the death penalty, while for adultery and other potential capital offenses, other compensation could be made. The offense is still very serious, and expensive reparations are required, such as the sacrificial ram. Yet clearly the law protects girls who were taken as servants for their parents' debt. Based on Leviticus 19 and a surface reading of Exodus 21, it may seem that women were treated as property. However, we've observed that despite Israel's inherited and imperfect patriarchal structure, these laws actually serve to protect women as well as the family structure, which was central to Israelite society. Rather than viewing these law texts as demeaning to women, we should actually see them as protecting the vulnerable. Now, to get further perspective, however, consider again other ancient Near Eastern cultures in this regard. Punishments were often of the vicious sort. For committing certain crimes, men would have to give up their wife, daughter, ox, or slave, a clear indication that a woman was often deemed the property of a man. Middle Assyrian laws punished not a rapist, but a rapist's wife, and even allowed her to be gang raped. In other ancient Near Eastern laws, men could freely whip their wives, pull out their hair, mutilate their ears, or strike them, a dramatic contrast to Israel's laws, which gave no such permissions. Again, Despite some of Israel's problematic social structures and corresponding laws, Israel's legal system, if faithfully followed, created a morally preferable environment to other societies in the ancient Near East. The operative words are faithfully followed, which Israel wasn't very good at doing. Now let's look at foreign slaves from Leviticus 25, verses 42 through 49. Where it says, "For they are my servants," God says, "whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over them with rigor, but you shall fear your God. And as for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you and their families who are with you, and which they may beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor. Now, if a sojourner or stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him and his family may redeem him, or if he's able to, he may redeem himself." Here we come across a jarring text, a significant distinction between Israelite servants or employees and foreign workers in Israel. Does this text regard foreign workers as nothing more than property? Before we jump to this conclusion, we should look at what precedes this text and at other scripture and another scriptural consideration. When we do so, we'll continue to see that these foreigners were still nowhere near the chattel slaves of the antebellum South. We'll also see that a significant presence of apparently resentful foreigners required stricter measures than those for cooperative aliens who were willing to follow Israel's laws. Since the only Israelites were allowed to own land which ultimately belonged to Yahweh, foreigners who weren't in Israel just for business purposes were typically incorporated into Israelite homes to serve there, unless they chose to live elsewhere. And strangers in the land could, if they chose, not only be released, but potentially become persons of means. For poor foreigners wanting to live in Israel, voluntary servitude was pretty much the only option. So let's look at being nice to strangers in Leviticus 19:33 and 34. The Israelites were commanded to love the stranger in the land. When a stranger resides with you in the land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you. You shall love him as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This is reinforced in Deuteronomy 10:19, where it says, "So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." So before we jump to conclusions about harsh and oppressive Old Testament laws regarding outsiders, we should take such texts as Leviticus 19:33 and 34 and Deuteronomy 10:19 seriously. Since the land belonged to Yahweh, who graciously loaned it to the Israelite families, foreign settlers could not acquire it. Yet a foreigner could become an alien if he embraced Israel's ways fully. He would no longer be a permanent outsider. Allowances were made for aliens in terms of gleaning laws and other provisions. The foreigner didn't need to feel excluded in the host country. Presumably, he wasn't forced to remain in Israel either. Though without land, he could share in the community life and religious celebrations of Israel with many improved economic and status perks. Think of Rahab or Ruth here. Let's look at the foreigner and the alien. The established alien and the sojourner were those who had embraced the worship of Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. They had come from another land and had sought refuge in Israel for perhaps political or economic reasons, like Abraham in Hebron, Moses in Midian, Elimelech and his family in Moab, or the Israelites in Egypt. Perhaps the best term for such persons is ethnic minorities, persons with distinctive racial or cultural traditions who are vulnerable to exploitation or discrimination by dominant groups in the population. They had settled in the land for some time. They didn't have their own land, but had come under the protection of Israel. Furthermore, these resident aliens were proselytes or converts to the nation of Israel, to the religion of Israel. In fact, the term ger is typically translated proselytos in the Greek Old Testament. Aliens and foreigners, however, were permitted to eat non-kosher food, but aliens couldn't eat food with blood in it. They kept the Sabbath laws, and they were circumcised, which meant they could celebrate Passover. God is said to love the alien, and the alien was not to be oppressed. However, the well-to-do alien was restricted to having an Israelite servant in his home. An Israelite couldn't be a debt servant of a non-Israelite alien, especially in light of God's deliverance from Egypt. Foreigners, which are Nokrim or sometimes Beni Nekkar, literally sons of a foreign land, were in a different category. Perhaps they came into Israel as prisoners of war. They came voluntarily to engage in business transactions. They didn't embrace Yahweh worship and remain uncircumcised. The foreigner didn't show concern for Israel's purity laws, and he was allowed to eat non-kosher foods. He likely didn't have a problem eating a dead animal not killed by a human. What's remarkable in Israel's legislation is the accommodation to the foreigner. If an Israelite saw an animal that had died by itself, he couldn't eat it. Eating it would make him unclean, but he could give it to an alien or sell it to a foreigner living in his town. This is a way to show love to the alien and foreigner alike, even if the foreigner didn't embrace Israel's purity laws and didn't identify as fully as possible with God's people. Further, we've already noted that in a post-war situation, such as that described in Deuteronomy 21, 10-14, a foreign woman could follow certain requirements to separate from her former culture and embrace her new one. After this, she could be elevated to the status of an Israelite wife, a far cry from acquiring chattel. Just because an outsider to Israel came to live in the land and didn't, just because an outsider to Israel came to live in the land, that didn't mean he'd necessarily become a household servant. The stranger, ger, or sojourner, toshab, were often used synonymously. That the stranger or sojourner could become a person of means. The foreigner, the nokri, the word typically, though not always, has a negative connotation, often came to Israel for business. Foreigners were normally present in a country for purposes of trade, which meant that goods or money given to them on credit were usually investments or advance payments on goods, not loans because of poverty. We should factor in all the above into our discussion of foreigners before looking at the downside of foreigners as servants. There's more to the word foreigner than first meets the eye. In the Old Testament, the term is associated with someone who's dangerous or hostile to what's good and to God's purposes for Israel. The foreigner is frequently associated with idolatry, hostility, or the enemy. Solomon married foreign wives who led him astray into idolatry. Proverbs warns against the stranger foreign woman who is an adulteress. The worship of false gods in the Old Testament is often described as spiritual adultery. Because of difficulty in integrating into Israel, foreigners may have served as forced laborers who worked for the state. They performed public work such as construction or undertook agricultural work as well. Under Kings David and Solomon, Ammonites and Canaanites engaged in such work. We don't know if they served part-time or permanently. Overall, the alien or stranger or temporary resident in Israel wasn't to be oppressed, but was to be dealt with fairly. Repeatedly in the law of Moses, God showed that outsiders or foreigners should be treated well. So if he's really this terrible moral monster like the new atheists like to paint him out to be, why would he be concerned that outsiders and foreigners be treated well? Let's make some observations about some special considerations. What about loan discrimination? For Israelites, loans were given at cost. No interest was permitted for Israelites. However, loans with interest were allowed when it came to a foreigner in Israel. Wasn't this unfair to not charge the Israelites interest, but to charge interest to the foreigner? Some have argued so, but as we've seen, typically foreigners sought loans for business or investment purposes, not because they were destitute and needed money to relieve their debt, let alone to keep them from starving. In other instances, the presence of foreigners was tricky. If Israel fought against other nations, some prisoners of war might need to be assimilated into Israelite society. Structures were needed to prevent them from rising up in rebellion against their new masters or remaining consolidated in their own land where they could muster forces to launch a counterattack. In cases where Israel's captured enemies, especially the males, didn't care for the laws of the land and posed an internal threat to Israel's safety, servanthood was one way of subduing or controlling this menace. Certain economic, military, and social realities made things messy. Even so, Israel couldn't oppress, or exploit foreigners. Deuteronomy 23 shows concern for desperate, threatened foreign slaves, and this text sheds light on, or even improves on, previous legislation in Leviticus 25. And there's no hint of racism here, as though being a non-Israelite was justification for Israelite slavekeeping. In fact, as Roy Gain argues, the laws of Exodus 21 protect from abuse all persons in service to others, not just Jews. Notice something important in Leviticus 25, 44 to 47, which is typically overlooked by the critics. We've seen that kidnapping and slave trading were clearly prohibited by the Mosaic Law, but foreigners would come to Israel as prisoners of war and, given the dangers of an internal uprising, would be pressed into supervised construction or agricultural work. Yet the very sojourners and aliens who were first pressed into service were the same ones who had the capability of saving up sufficient means. Yes, in principle, all persons in servitude within Israel except criminals could be released. At this juncture, let's note several important points about the foreign servitude passage of Leviticus 25. The first point, the verb acquire, Cana, in Leviticus 25, 39 to 51, need not involve selling or purchasing foreign servants. For example, the same word appears in Genesis 4:1, speaking of Eve's having gotten a man-child, and Genesis 14:19, when it refers to God being the possessor of heaven and earth. Later, Boaz acquired Ruth as a wife in Ruth 4:10, although she was not inferior, but rather a full partner in Boaz's eyes. Second, in some cases, foreign servants could become elevated and apparently fully equal to Israelite citizens. For instance, a descendant of Caleb ended up marrying an Egyptian servant. Now, Sheshan had no sons, only daughters, and Sheshan had an Egyptian servant whose name was Jarha. Sheshan gave his daughter to Jarha, his servant, in marriage, and she bore him Atai. That's in 1 Chronicles chapter 2. Not only do we have marriage between a foreign servant and an established free person with quite a pedigree, but the key implication is that inheritance rights would fall to the servant's offspring. Genealogy lists Jarha's son Atai, who had a son Nathan, whose son was Zabad, and so on. Third, foreign runaway slaves were given protection within Israel's borders and not returned to their harsh masters. Kidnapping slaves was also prohibited, so serving within Israelite households was to be a safe haven for any foreigner. It was not to be an oppressive setting, but offered economic and social stability. I wish skeptics would hear that. It was not to be an oppressive setting, but it was to offer economic and social stability. It's supposed to benefit everyone. These slaves, this was a contractual agreement between the slave and master. The master was to care for the slave, provide for the slave, room and board. This is not a inhumane arrangement. Now, are some sinful practices involved? Yes. Are these laws perfect? No. As we've seen in other places in this book, or will see in other places in this book, God's dealing with fallen people who make some fallen choices, and the laws were increasing in conformity and godlikeness. Fourth, we've seen that the Hebrew servant in Exodus 21:2 could well have been an outsider who had come to be a resident alien and was to be released in the 7th year, presumably to go back to his country of origin. However, he could make the arrangement permanent if he loved his master or employer and wanted to stay under his care. Given the security and provision of room and board for landless aliens, this arrangement could apparently be extended into the next generations. This setup wasn't to be permanent unless the servant chose to stay with his master. John Golding Gay writes, perhaps many people would be reasonably happy to settle for being long-term or lifelong servants. Servants do count as part of the family. Imagine that. So this servant agreed to be to work for this master, and when they did so, in effect, they would become part of that master's family. He adds, one can even imagine people who started off as debt servants volunteering to become permanent servants because they loved their master and his household. Fifth, the text of Leviticus 25 makes clear that the alien or stranger could potentially work himself out of debt and become a person of means in Israel, if the means of a stranger or sojourner with you become sufficient. Verse 47. This is another indication that he wasn't stuck in lifelong servitude without a choice. The terms stranger and sojourner are connected to the terms used in verse 45, sojourners who live as aliens and strangers among you. That is, these acquired servants could potentially better themselves to the point of hiring servants themselves. Of course, an alien could not hire an Israelite. As we've seen in other scenarios, these situations weren't ideal given the inferior social structures of the time. I made allusion to that just a moment or two ago. God instituted laws for Israel that began where the people were. So the law that you see in the Old Testament was not supposed to be the end-all, be-all for all time. But we see remarkable humanization encoded in Israel's laws. For foreign and Israelite servants alike. Membership has its privileges. If a foreigner happened to be poor, this circumstance could help create incentive for the foreigner to become part of the Israelite community and share in, say, the Passover, something the alien could celebrate. The foreigner, Ben Nakar, wasn't allowed to participate in this feast, since he didn't care to identify himself with Israel's covenant and with Yahweh. Again, why should loans be at cost for people who chose to live in and off Israel without entering into the corporate life and worship of Israel? We should expect some difference between them. Think of America as a legal immigration situation, a complex matter that's often emotionally charged on both sides of the debate. We all know how this goes. Illegals slip across the United States-Mexico border to benefit from the U.S.'s economic way of life. Meanwhile, many foreigners desiring to live in the United States may follow all the legal channels to acquire a U.S. green card, which is resident alien status, in order to perhaps eventually become naturalized citizens. They wait a long time for their applications to be processed. Even so, their applications may become rejected. Yet, illegals completely bypass the legal channels and maneuver their way across the border. Copan is not unsympathetic with the concerns of illegals looking for a better life here in the United States, and we should extend kindness and personal concern to them. Perhaps churches can try to assist undocumented aliens in getting a fair trial and making sure they're treated respectfully as God's image bearers. Perhaps churches could even sponsor them in hopes of their becoming naturalized citizens. But for the sake of maintaining order and preserving privilege and dignity of citizenship in a country, like Romans 13 would advocate, priority should be given to tax-paying citizens over illegals when it comes to healthcare, driver's licenses, insurance, and the like. It's understandable that when legal protocols aren't followed, certain privileges are withheld. The same held true in ancient Israel. The foreigner was more like an illegal immigrant. The resident or alien, however, sought to play by Israel's rules. Unlike the resident alien, foreigners weren't willing to abide by Israel's covenant relationship with God, so they shouldn't expect to receive all the privileges of an Israelite citizen. Ruth the Moabitess embraced the God of Israel Ruth the Moabitess embraced the God of Israel, who's also the God of her mother-in-law Naomi. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. If Gentiles like Ruth or Rahab or Uriah the Hittite were willing to fully embrace Israel's God, people and laws. If Gentiles like Ruth or Rahab or Uriah the Hittite were willing to fully embrace Israel's God, Israel's people, and Israel's laws, then they could become more easily incorporated into mainstream Israel life, even if they couldn't own land. And foreigners didn't have to come to Israel at all. Like the credit card company American Express used to say, membership has its privileges. The same pertained to membership within Israel. Now let's make some final considerations. Leviticus 25 reflected an attempt to regulate and control potential abuses that often come through greed and social status. This legislation created a safety net for vulnerable Israelites. Its intent was to stop generational cycles of poverty. The story of Ruth and Naomi actually puts flesh and bones on the Sinai legislation. It brings us from the theocratical laws to the practical realm of everyday life in Israel. We see how the relevant laws were to be applied when death, poverty, and uncertainty came upon an Israelite. We also witness a Gentile who came to Israel with their mother-in-law. Both were vulnerable and seeking refuge with relatives who could assist them. They were provided for as Ruth was able to glean in the fields of Boaz as a kinsman redeemer. Naomi was cared for in her old age. We should consider Leviticus 25, verse 44 in light of the Ruth narrative, where it says, "You may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you." Interestingly, Boaz announced to the elders of Bethlehem that he had acquired Ruth as his wife in Ruth 4:10. Does this mean that Boaz thought Ruth was property? Hardly. Boaz hardly thought Ruth was property. Boaz had the utmost respect for Ruth and viewed Ruth as an equal partner. Boaz viewed Ruth as an equal partner. Was a foreign worker of lower social rank than an Israelite servant? Yes, a foreign worker was of lower social rank than an Israelite servant. Was this an ideal situation? No, it was not ideal for a foreign worker to be of lower social rank than an Israelite servant. Is Copan advocating this for contemporary society? No, hardly. Let's not forget the negative, sometimes God-opposing association bound up with the Old Testament use of the term foreigner. We often detect in this term a refusal to assimilate with Israel's ways and covenant relationship with God, which conflicted with God's intentions for his people. Again, foreigners could settle in the land, embrace Israel's ways, and become aliens or sojourners, which would have given them greater entry into Israelite society, Israelite social life and economic benefit. And as Copan has emphasized, the foreigner could have chosen to live elsewhere rather than in Israel. So we have a lot of complicating factors to consider here. Even so, if we pay attention to the biblical text, the underlying attitude toward foreigners is far better than that found in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. God constantly reminded Israel that they were strangers and aliens in Egypt. All those references there from Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. This memory was to shape Israel's treatment of strangers in the land. That's why God commanded the following: caring for the needy and the alien in Leviticus 23:22. That's why God commanded loving the alien in Deuteronomy 10:19. That's why God commanded providing for his basic need of food in Deuteronomy 24. That's why God commanded promptly paying for the alien's labor. In addition, the Old Testament looks to the ultimate salvation of, yes, the foreigner and his incorporation into God's people. The foreigner who's joined himself to the Lord, Isaiah 56. Lest we think that a foreigner's permanent servitude, which could well be understood as voluntary in Leviticus 25, meant that his master could take advantage of him, we should recall the pervasive theme throughout the law of Moses of protection and concern for those in servitude. They weren't to be taken advantage of. So a master should not take advantage of his servant. I think a lot of the negative knee-jerk emotional reaction against the principle of slavery in the Old Testament, I think that negative reaction comes partially because of many misunderstandings on these texts, which Copan is dealing with in chapters like this one. And one of those things is the assumption that masters were going to intentionally try to take advantage of servants. And God had laws in place to prevent that very thing. So you shall not hand over to his master a slave who's escaped his master from you. He shall live with you in your midst, in the place which he shall choose, in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. That's Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16. This provision wasn't simply for a foreign slave returning to Israel, but also for a foreign servant within Israel who was being mistreated. Israel's legislation regarding foreign slaves showed concern for their well-being, very much like the Code of Hammurabi, for example, which had no regard for an owner's treatment of his slaves. Let's compare some servitude texts. Let's try to tie up some loose ends here. We looked at Deuteronomy 15 in the last chapter, so we won't cite that text in full here. This is the famous release text where God commanded generosity and goodwill toward debt servants who were being released. God expressed the desire that there would be no poor in the land at all. Scholars have claimed that this passage stands in tension with the earlier servitude laws of Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25, and we could add here Leviticus 19. If so, tension may not be as great as some have assumed. For instance, Exodus 21:7 doesn't expressly say that female servants were to be set free after the 7th year. We've argued, though, that this is implied that female servants should be set free after the 7th year. Tension exists if we assume that gender switching isn't allowed by the texts, but that's not so. We could add that verses 26 and 27 mention that a male or female servant may be freed if injured. If he or she was killed by an employer's abuse, the employer was to be put to death. At any rate, Deuteronomy 15:12 explicitly affirms that both male and female servants were in view. Both males and females were to be given freedom in the 7th year, the sabbatical release. If a genuine tension exists, then this passage suggests that the arrangement for acquiring a wife in Exodus 21 verses 7 to 10 had later been dropped in Israel. What about the law that a male servant couldn't leave with his wife and children if his wife were given by his master in Exodus 21:4? This appears to change by Leviticus 25, verses 40 to 42 in the Jubilee year laws, where the children and presumably the wife were to go free with the husband or father. Also, in contrast to Exodus 21, 2 through 6, and Leviticus 25, 41 through 42, doesn't distinguish between children born before and children born during indentured servanthood. Yet, already in Leviticus 25, in the Jubilee year, every 50th year, and the children, and presumably the wife, were released with their father and husband. We do see some tensions between earlier texts like Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15. We don't need to throw up our hands in despair at hopelessly contradictory texts. Rather, what we have here is a dynamic adjustment and a moral upgrade taking place within a short span of time in national Israel's early life. Remember the daughters of Zelophehad who petitioned Moses for adjustments of the law in Numbers 27. Moses took their case before Yahweh, who approved their request. This is another example of an adjustment in Israel's laws, a move from inferior legislation to a more improved legal status. This is a far cry from Christopher Hitchens' notion of unalterable Old Testament laws. No, the Old Testament laws, as this shows, were alterable. Christopher Wright points out that in the final editing of the Pentateuch, the editors would certainly have been aware of these differences and tensions, yet kept all those texts in place. They wouldn't remove them. The editorial hand shows remarkable skill in handling the text. In fact, the majority of scholars see Exodus giving the oldest law in Deuteronomy, later revising and expanding it, which could also apply to the Leviticus text. So the fact that these texts coexist in the same body of work suggests a possible reconciliation or rationale for doing so. Wright sees Deuteronomy as modifying, extending, and to some extent reforming earlier laws with additional explicit theological rationale and motivation. Even the ancient Israelite would recognize that Exodus 21, which emphasizes humanness of servants, stood in certain tension with the later text of Deuteronomy 15 and Leviticus 25. So to obey Deuteronomy to a certain extent necessarily meant to no longer comply with Exodus or Leviticus. These texts were deliberately kept together in part to reflect this adjustment. Apparently, these tensions didn't seem all that wildly contradictory to the final editor of this portion of the Bible. This point serves to illustrate the living, historical, contextual nature of the growth of Scripture. By the time we get to the prophet Amos, whose ministry was in the northern kingdom of Israel, God levels harsh words against those who were buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. Corrupt judges were bribed by the rich to make slave labor available to them. The poor were heavily fined and when they were unable to pay, they were sold into servitude at low prices, thrown in with the sweepings of wheat. In Amos, the Israelite poor were being mistreated and even being traded for a pair of sandals. How much worse it must have been for aliens in Israel, whom God commanded Israel to protect. Isaiah expressed a similar concern for Gentile fugitives fleeing Moab. Notice the great concern shown for the vulnerable and those escaping dangerous situations. Hide the fugitives. Do not betray the refugees. Let the Moabite fugitives stay with you. Be their shelter from the destroyer. The oppressor will come to an end, and the destruction will cease. The aggressor will vanish from the land. That's Isaiah chapter 16, verses 3 and 4. In the prophetic book of Joel, in chapter 2, verse 29, God made an egalitarian promise to pour out His Spirit on all flesh, young and old, male and female, including male and female servants. The same theme is found in Job 31:15, where master and slave alike come from the same place, the mother's womb. They're fundamentally equal. Reflecting on the wider context of scripture passages reminds us not to focus on a single text, but to see how each passage fits into the broader whole. Furthermore, any deviations from ideal moral standards of human equality and dignity set down a creation are the result of human hard-heartedness. Let's repeat that one. Any deviations from ideal moral standards of human equality and dignity between master and servant, between male and female, set down at creation, are the result of human hard-heartedness, not the result of an immoral monster. Over and over, we're reminded of Israel's superior legislation in contrast to the rest of the ancient Near East. That concludes chapter 13. Next time, we will continue the look at slavery, this time transitioning from the Old Testament to the New Testament, where we will look at slavery in the New Testament in chapter 14 of Is God a Moral Monster?, where we make sense of the Old Testament God by Paul Copan. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And please keep your eye out for the published work, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist, the commentary on the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms. If you don't see it available online, contact me directly. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.